It's the 2024 U.S. presidential debate, and Kamala Harris dodges a really important question.
We know that illegal border crossings reached a record high in the Biden administration. Why did the administration wait until 6 months before the election to act? And would you have done anything differently from President Biden on this?
She starts by talking about her record.
So I'm the only person on this stage who has prosecuted transnational criminal organizations.
Then changes the subject.
I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies. He talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter, windmills cause cancer, and what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early.
Trump takes the bait.
She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go.
No, it's a clever tactic, but at the same time, it's not a surprise why Harris decided to use it on a question about immigration. More Americans think Trump would handle immigration better than Harris would. And it's why headlines describe it as her biggest liability and biggest weakness. But how did immigration become such a weakness for Harris? And what's she doing about it?
The United States is a sovereign nation, and I believe we have a duty to set rules at our border and to enforce them.
Let's start by separating immigration into two main categories. People who enter the U.S. with permission from the government are legal immigrants. People who enter without it are illegal or undocumented. But some can become legal if they turn themselves in and seek asylum. Asylum's a form of protection that the U.S. gives to people who have been persecuted. Typically, asylum seekers have to reach U.S. soil first to apply for it. Then immigration courts decide whether or not to grant it. Since the 1990s, the U.S. has given asylum to roughly between 10 and 45,000 people a year. But in the 2010s, hundreds of thousands of people, especially families and unaccompanied children, began to seek it. Most were coming from Mexico and Central America, paying traffickers to take them on dangerous routes north and applying at the U.S. southern border. This chart shows the number of times U.S. Border Patrol encounters a migrant there. Now, many of these encounters are actually the same person trying to cross the border multiple times, but this measurement gives you a good idea of what was happening at the border. Encounters rise sharply under President Donald Trump, recede during the pandemic, then spike again, and continue to rise under President Joe Biden until peaking around 250,000 per month in 2023. More migrants than the U.S. immigration system could handle.
1,200 migrants turning themselves in to border authorities every day.
People are fleeing crime, gang violence, corruption. They're feeling dictatorships.
Texas still recovering from the last swell of migrants which overwhelmed Border Patrol.
I'm David Bier, Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute.
Do you have a sense of... I asked David Bier what was behind this wave of migration.
Really, what was going on at the time was unprecedented labor shortage in the United States. And at the same time, you had all of this crushing economic downturn south of the border in South America and Mexico.
The crisis fueled a political war in the U.S. over the border, while President Donald Trump enacted several restrictions that made it harder for migrants to seek asylum there. The strictest being Title 42, a pandemic measure that allowed Border Patrol to expel migrants before they could even ask for asylum. It led Democrats to argue against more border security as the sole solution and emphasize expanding legal pathways instead.
I want to see us expand legal immigration.
I will immediately, by executive action, reinstate DACA status and DACA protection to those young people.
We're a nation that says if you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come.
Then when Biden became president, he repealed many of Trump's strictest border policies, but kept Title 42 in place until 2023. When migrant encounters kept rising anyways, Republicans, for the most part, began blaming him for the crisis.
I don't think it's fair at all. I think the evidence is that he did everything within the power of the federal government to continue to enforce Title 42. The system was still overwhelmed.
Donald Trump exaggerated the problem and even began demonizing the migrants.
Our southern border has been erased, and our country is being invaded by millions and millions of unknown people, many of whom are entering for a very bad and sinister reason. Criminals coming into our country, Criminals, absolute criminals. A catastrophe. They will not be good for our country.
Now, what's important to note here, and what I found most fascinating about this story, to be honest, is that the border crisis, plus Trump's extreme rhetoric, seems to have led to a profound shift in how Americans view immigration. Between 2019 and 2022, the percentage of Republicans who favored increasing border security was consistent, but the number of Democrats who did increased 10%. And more broadly, the number of Americans who want all immigration to decrease rose to 55%, a majority for the first time since 2005.
I mean, this is enormous. In any public policy area, you'd be saying, wow, you don't see changes like this.
This shift went against Biden. In 2023, only 33% of American adults approved of how he was handling it. Immigration had become his biggest weakness, and his vice president was increasingly involved.
Do not come. Do not come.
Immigration is both a top issue in this election, but clearly one of the most complex and changing nearly every day. So yesterday, Trump announced his plan to hire 10,000 more Border Patrol agents. I found the story where I get all my news now, which is Ground News. Ground News is a website and an app that takes news sources from all over the world and puts them into one place, but then gives me a fuller picture of every story. I'm thrilled to say that Ground News is sponsoring this episode. Ground News tells me that right-leaning publications are focusing on how Trump wants to increase the wages of Border Patrol agents, while left-leaning publications like NBC are careful to remind readers that Trump killed a bipartisan bill that would have done something very similar. Ground News has changed the way that I've followed and even covered this election. It's the best way to get an in-depth understanding of every story. And I know that if you're a fan of Search Party, you want that same level of understanding in your news feeds. So right now, we've partnered with Ground News to get you 50% off their Advantage plan. All you got to do is use my code ground.news/searchparty or the QR code. 50% off is the biggest discount they've ever offered. Great for anyone who wants a more deeper understanding of what's happening in the world. Ground News and I share the same mission. That's to make the news more understandable and transparent to everyone. So thanks again to Ground News for supporting us. Now let's take you back to the episode.
I've asked her, the VP today, because she's the most qualified person to do it, to lead our efforts with Mexico and the Northern Triangle.
In 2021, Biden assigned his vice president, Kamala Harris, a new role. Most of the migrants crossing the border were coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So Biden asked Harris to find ways to improve the economic conditions in those countries. It was a minor role that focused narrowly on long-term solutions and had nothing to do with border policy, but it put Harris in the immigration spotlight. She convinced private companies to invest over $5 billion in these countries to create jobs and opportunities. And she visited Central America, where she began to take a harder line on migrants.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
In the following months, encounters with migrants from these countries fell, but overall encounters stayed high because of more migrants from other countries, such as Venezuela and China. Harris wasn't responsible for them or for the border at all. But Republicans began calling her Biden's border czar and blaming her for the border crisis too.
More than 70 days ago, Biden named cackling Kamala as border czar. Now, Kamala, I want you to stand here and look at what you've done.
Republicans kept hammering Biden and Harris even as they began to crack down on the border. Biden first backed a bill that would add significant restrictions to the border while also creating more legal pathways for migrants from some countries. Many Republicans supported it, but after Trump disapproved, they dropped it. Biden then enacted some of those restrictions anyway, through executive orders. Almost immediately, migrant encounters fell and remained low into the next year as Harris became the nominee. Now she's put more border security at the heart of her campaign.
I believe there should be consequence. We have laws that have to be followed and enforced that address and deal with people who cross our border illegally.
Huge majorities of both Harris and Trump supporters agree there should be more border security. But more voters still trust Trump to handle immigration over Harris. Because while many voters are almost certainly blaming her for the border crisis, her support for more border security may be making it more difficult to argue against Trump's own policies.
Unfortunately for Harris, the reason why it is such a weak point for her, if voters are now told you should want Trump policies, they're going to say, okay, well, why would I elect you to deliver me Trump policies? I could just vote for Trump
This could be why she chooses to distract Trump rather than let him say that.
Is that people start leaving his rallies early.
People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go.
The thing is, more border security only fixes half the problem. And Harris right now is the only candidate talking about the other half.
It's unfortunately a catch-22 situation where we can't solve legal immigration unless we secure the border, but we can't secure the border without solving legal immigration.
As the last few years have shown, people are willing to risk their lives to reach the U.S., no matter what restrictions are in place. And they could keep overwhelming the border unless the U.S. makes it easier for them to come legally.
Why is illegal immigration happening? Well, it's happening because there's no legal ways to come, but just 3% of the people who applied for permanent residence status this year actually got it. It's a million bureaucratic rules that get in the way of people's ability to come legally.
Creating more pathways for legal immigrants would funnel migrants away from the border and into a more orderly system that the U.S. can control. So far, Harris is promising to do just that.
And we need clear legal pathways for people seeking to come into our country. And we must make our current system work better.
It's easier said than done, and she hasn't specified many details, but voters would likely support it. Huge majorities of both Harris and Trump supporters agree that the U.S. should admit more high-skilled immigrants legally. And a majority of U.S. voters believe that illegal immigrants already in the U.S. should be given a pathway to citizenship.
Got to do something about legal immigration. If you're not even talking about that subject, we're a long ways off from a deal about how to address it.
You have to get them the hell out. You have to get them out. I'm sorry. They've destroyed it.
Trump, meanwhile, has become even more extreme and remains laser-focused on border security, but his plans would also severely curtail legal immigration. So while Americans may trust Harris less on immigration, her proposals are way more in line with what may actually fix the problem and closer to what Americans say they actually want. All right, that's the end of our election coverage. If you haven't seen our video about Donald Trump, you can check that out. That's about U.S. alliances and NATO. After this, I'm jumping on some quick breaking news about the Middle East, so that's another geopolitics story. But we're going to return to sports right after that with some stories I think you'll really like. Thanks again for supporting Surge Party. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should do it. We publish every 2 weeks, so we've got a few more videos to round out 2024. If you've got any suggestions for next year, please let me know. Love to hear your story recommendations. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you in a couple weeks.